We're going to go back in history, as we often do, this time to the middle of the 1700s, and a poem that was written by a man whose name was Thomas Gray. And the name of the poem is Elegy in a Country Churchyard. And this has become like a very famous poem. It's, I don't know how many of you have read it or came across it in your poetry classes that you took in high school, and maybe also at Fordham. It's a very powerful poem. The protagonist in the poem, or Thomas Gray, I guess, talks about what he feels and sees as he walks by a churchyard with tombstones. And one of the things he feels is, who knows how many people with great talent, and Gray was aware of it because he himself had talent as a poet, but he wondered how many people who walk by this graveyard know that there might be people buried in the graveyard who were great poets. In the poem, there's talk about mute, inglorious Miltons. This is Milton, John Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost. But Gray wonders how many mute and glorious Miltons are buried here, meaning people with an enormous amount of talent, but nobody knows about that. And in my favorite 4 lines of the poem, Gray says, many a gem of purest ray serene, the dark unfathomed caves of ocean bare. Many a flower was born to blush unseen and waste its sweetness in the desert air. So what Gray is talking about there is there's no doubt an enormous amount of talent out there in the world. But this is like, the middle of the 1700s. And Gray is keenly aware of the fact that even though there are a lot of people with talent out in the world, most of the world will never know about that, will never hear about that. Many a flower was born to blush unseen, and waste its sweetness in the desert air. And this was the middle of the 1700s, but this continued into the 1800s and the 1900s. Back in the middle of the 1700s, the only way that anybody could become famous, get their work out there, was if they were fortunate enough to know a publisher. Because as I've already mentioned to you in our last lecture, the only game in town as far as media are concerned was the printing press. By the 20th century, it had gotten, a lot better. There were other ways that you could become famous. You could become a movie star. You could become a screenwriter. You could become a star on radio. You could become a television star as we get into the 1960s and after. So yeah, that was good in terms of more people were able to get their work out there. But the same problem, the same obstacle that existed in the middle of the 1700s when Thomas Gray wrote that poem, that same obstacle existed throughout the 20th century. And the obstacle is something that I don't know how many of you have come across this in other communications courses. The name that we communication and media theorists give this obstacle is gatekeeper. Gatekeeper. What does that mean? Well, it means that if you want to get on television, if you want to get into the movies, if you want to become a recording artist, if you want to become a best-selling author, if you want to become a famous poet, and you have all that talent, let's assume you do have the talent. Sometimes people don't have talent, right? Not everybody has an equal amount of talent. And sometimes people don't have the requisite talent needed to become famous out there in the world. But Thomas Gray's hypothesis, and I think he's right, is that a lot of people do have talent. And the reason why nobody knows about them, I'm now saying as a communication theorist, is because they didn't pass muster with a gatekeeper. So here are some examples of gatekeepers. You all heard of the Beatles, right? How many of you know that the Beatles were turned down in the late 1950s and early 1960s? They were turned down by 25 different record companies. Now, for those of you, I know at least one of you is doing research on the music business, so she knows this. But probably the rest of you may vaguely have heard of this term, an A&R person. It stands for artist and repertoire. It's like a fancy, almost Victorian term. That person in record companies used to have this really critically important job. And that job was somebody came to him, it was usually him, occasionally her, with a demo. That is a record that wasn't a fully produced record. It was just usually someone singing, a couple of instruments. And the A&R person listened to it and either said, wow, that is really great. We're going to give you a contract. Or the A&R person was much more likely to say, I just don't hear it, you know, sounds good. Or the A&R person might say, that's good, I like it, but it's not for our record company. You know, your sound is too R&B, rhythm and blues. We're after a more country sound or a more standard Frank Sinatra sound or whatever. So the Beatles are turned down by 25 different record companies. I mean, just think about that. Somebody came into an A&R guy and said, hey, let me put this on the turntable. What do you think of this? And the person heard, she loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah. And the A&R guy said, I don't know, it's good, but it's just not for our record company. That happened 25 times. And fortunately for the Beatles and fortunately for the world, the 26th record company said, wow, that's interesting. That's a really original sound. I'm going to give you guys a contract. But the Beatles had to push on to 25, past 25 rejections. And by the way, it helps to have a good manager. The Beatles in those days were helped by their manager. And the Beatles were not the only group this happened to. And this not only affected music, it affected all creative areas. There's a book by the name of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. It sold millions and millions of copies in the 1960s. I don't know how many of you have read it or heard about it. The author's name is Persig. He claims, now I don't know, I haven't checked over this guy's, life or, examined his records, but he claims, Robert Persig claims that this book was turned down by over 250 different publishers. I don't even know if there were 250 different publishers, but not surprised to hear that it was turned down by a lot of publishers. It was turned down and turned down and turned down until finally a publisher said, yeah, I like this. And that publisher was rewarded with a best-selling novel. So this is what has happened to all kinds of authors, all kinds of time. And there's an example that has a far worse ending. In fact, the ending is not an ending that is a happy ending in any sense of the word. This story concerns an author by the name of John Kennedy O'Toole, and the story with him is he wrote a book called A Confederacy of Dunces, and the book was sent to a publisher in New York, a big publisher in New York, and the acquisitions editor at that publishing house liked the book. And it was a novel about life in the South, in Southern America. It's not South America, in the southern part of the United States of America. That's why it's called the Confederacy of Dunces. And this editor worked with the author for over a year. You know, the author making suggestions to the author made some changes. The suggestions were then sent back with the changes to the editor. The editor liked the changes, made other suggestions. This went back and forth for over a year. Finally, though, the editor said, look, you know what, we've been going over this for over a year. I do think your book has a lot of merit. I see a lot of excellence in your book. But again, and these are these infamous words, these infamous words that often happen. I just don't think it's right for our publishing house. And so the book was turned down. Understandably, the author was devastated. And a few years later, he took his own life. Now, you know, suicide is obviously a very sad and terrible thing. And, you know, psychologists will correctly say, usually when a person takes his or her own life, it's not because of one thing, it's because of their whole life. They just were not able to get on top of things and get it together. But certainly this book being turned down didn't improve the psychological outlook of the author. So he took his own life. But his mother, who of course was devastated by her son's suicide, had read the novel, A Confederacy of Dunces, and she thought it was a masterpiece. And so one day, this all took place in Louisiana. She went to the university in her town, and she waited outside an English class. And after the class was over, she went in to see the professor, and I don't know what their exact conversation was, but it was something along the lines of, look, I know this must be a bother to you, but if you'll just give me a few minutes of your time, I want to tell you about a novel, my son's novel. And she spoke to the professor for a few minutes, and she asked the professor, would he be willing to read the novel? Because she said, I think it's a great novel, but I'm, you know, the author's mother. Now, you know, as you know, I'm a professor myself, and, you know, like all other professors and all other people, who has the time to sit down and read a novel unexpectedly? So most professors, most of the time, would probably have politely declined this woman's request. But this professor did. He said later there was something in what the woman was telling me that just rang true to me. And I felt, the professor said, I had to read this novel. And the professor did read the novel. And he too thought the novel was a masterpiece. Now, most universities, including Fordham University, have university presses. They're usually not big presses, unless it's Oxford University Press. They're usually much smaller than that, but they are real legitimate presses. And they publish books usually by their own faculty, but they do publish books from other authors as well. So this professor took this book, A Confederacy of Dunces, to his university press. They read the book, an editor there, and that editor loved it also. And they published it. And now, to make a long story short, that novel not only became a bestseller, but it won some hugely important literary prizes. And to this very day, it's recognized as one of the greatest novels of the 20th century. So consider the sadness is too weak a word for this, of this situation. A guy writes a book. He puts his heart and soul into the book. It's turned down by a publisher that he's worked with for over a year. And unfortunately, because of his personality, he just didn't have it in him to take it to any more publishers. And he, soon after that, takes his own life. And then, because of his mother and this professor and this university press, the book is published, becomes a bestseller, becomes recognized as one of the great works of the 20th century. That is, as far as I'm concerned, the ipso facto, irrefutable case against gatekeeping. It deprives the world of great work because the gatekeeper is in error. The gatekeepers who said no to the Beatles, they were in error. The gatekeepers who said no to Robert Pirsig, they were in error. The gatekeeper who said no to Confederacy of Dunces, he was in error. But what could be done about it? A Confederacy of Dunces came out in the 1970s, and no one in the 1970s knew this then. But the answer to what could be done about this was just a few decades away. And it came from a company that you're all well aware of, a company that's received a lot of criticism because of the way it treats its workers, a company that is hated by the President of the United States because the same person, Jeff Bezos, owns this company, Amazon, and also owns the Washington Post, which publishes a lot of negative commentary and news about Donald Trump. So a lot of people hate Amazon. But although I think Amazon does a lot of things that are not right, I think Amazon deserves credit for what I'm going to tell you about now, because Amazon, after all of these centuries, broke the stranglehold of the gatekeeper. So we're now into the 1990s. Gatekeeping is still in place. Again, no one quite realizes, if you look at, say, 1995, what was just around the corner, right around the corner, in a revolution in social media. No one realized in 1995 that the record business, such as it had been, was literally in its final days. And no one realized that publishing was also in its final days in terms of the way that it had been. Because by the mid-1990s, although everybody was talking about Microsoft and that was like the big company, Apple, in terms of selling computers, they were the big company. Social media was still about a decade away. But a company began making a little noise for itself and began doing a pretty good business by the name of Amazon. And one of the first things that were sold on Amazon were books. And those books that were sold on Amazon were books that had been conventionally published. That is, they went through the gatekeeping process. They were books like The Confederacy of Dunces and Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, each of which in their own convoluted ways, and in the case, again, of John Kennedy O'Toole, tragic ways, had gone through the gatekeeping process. And Amazon did a pretty good business, a very good business selling those books. That's one of the reasons why they were able to expand and be so successful. But Jeff Bezos and the people around him were always looking for ways that they could improve their business and make more money. And I don't know who came up with the idea for the Kindle. I don't know whether it was Bezos himself or one of his chief lieutenants. But by the 2000s, 2001, 2002, 2003, Amazon began thinking about this interesting possibility. Let's say we could publish books ourselves, not have to rely on publishers to send us their books. And furthermore, we would publish these books not on paper, but we would publish the books digitally. Now, the people at Amazon realized, wow, I mean, this is a wild idea because it would save us the cost of mailing out the book, right? Anytime Amazon sells anything that has to go through the mail, somebody has to pay the postal service. So here was a good way of saving money. So that was the initial impetus. But then Amazon realized, wait a second, there's an additional way that we can make more money from these digital books. We don't have to rely on publishers to give us their paper books, and then either we or they convert the printed books into digital books, which now have become pretty easy anyway, because if you're talking about, let's just say 2005, 2006, authors were not writing handwritten manuscripts and sending them off to publishers anymore. They were not even clicking away on a typewriter. They were writing on a computer. And so a digital file existed of the book. And that digital file, in turn, was made into a program that could be used to print up pages of the book. But that's not the only thing that could be done with that. And so by 2007, 2008, Amazon, for the first time, began offering digital books. But this is where the decisive revolutionary spark happened. Because when Amazon started doing that, they quickly realized we don't need to depend on publishers anymore. Why don't we just deal directly with the authors? And if we do that, first of all, we can make much more money because we don't have to pay the publisher anything. And second of all, even the author will make much more money because Amazon is in effect the bookstore. So they can give the author a lot more money, a lot bigger cut of the sales than the conventional publisher. And again, I don't want to get too far, down the rabbit hole of the complexities of publishing, but to make that part of the long story short, in conventional publishing, the way it works, if you're an author, you're lucky if you get 10% of the royalties. What happens with the other 90%? Well, the bookstore gets its cut and the publisher gets its cut. So unless you're a best-selling author, you're not going to make much money, even if you do get a book published by a conventional publisher. 10%. If a book is selling for $10, you make $1. So yeah, if the book sells 1 million copies, you'll make $1 million. That's great. But if the book sells 10,000 copies, you make $10,000. Okay, that's good money, but it's not enough to live on for a year. So you have to write a whole bunch of books. Amazon said, hey, you know what? We'll pay authors 70%, not 10%, 70%. So if a book is selling, a digital book is selling for $9.99 on Amazon, Amazon keeps $3, the author gets $7. If the book sells 10,000 copies, you can just do the arithmetic. 7 times 10,000 is 70,000. All right, you're not going to get rich on 70,000, but you can live okay, for most of the year in most parts of the country on 70,000 a year. And of course, if the book sells more copies than that, you quickly can get a lot of money. So authors were very happy about this, but the question arose, how should Amazon get this material from authors? There were some people who suggested Amazon should set up an editorial board and they should look at every manuscript that comes into Amazon. In other words, Amazon set up its own gatekeeper. But here's where Jeff Bezos did make the decision himself. Jeff Bezos says, no, we don't need another set of gatekeepers. We're just going to publish anything that anyone sends in, as long as it's written okay. And even that, we can correct. We have things that check spelling, that can flag if a word is missing. When word of this came out, people began saying, well, what's going to happen is we're just going to get a flood of garbage on Kindles, because the traditional publishers, the traditional gatekeepers, they did an important job. They separated the wheat from the chaff and only published the wheat. Unfortunately, as in the case of the Beatles, where this almost happened, and in the case of the Confederacy of Dunces, where it did happen initially to the book, sometimes the gatekeepers, as I just detailed, not only keep out the unworthy stuff, but they keep out the wheat as well. So Amazon was gambling. They were saying, you know what, we think if we open the gates and allow everything that is sent into us to be published, yes, there'll be a lot of drivel, a lot of garbage that's published, but at the same time, we will be offering to the world material that might otherwise have been kept from the world. So who knows an example of a book that became a best-selling book? I'm going to tell you name of the book anyway, but in case anybody wants to raise their hand and tell me. This became a best-selling book, and it was made into a movie. It made everyone involved in it a huge amount of money. It's not considered to be a great book, but it was certainly a very important book and a best-selling book. And this book came into Amazon without any gatekeeping, and Amazon just published the book on their Kindle. Well, the name of the book is 50 Shades of Gray. And this is just one of many, many books that no gatekeeper approved it. Amazon published it, and the public loved it. And I would never say that this is a great work in terms of it being a great literary work, but the point is, a lot of people enjoyed it, and it made a lot of people happy, including the author and including people in the public who read and enjoyed the book, and people who then went on to see the movie. And there have been numerous examples of this. Right around this time, by the way, and this relates to something we talked about earlier in the last Zoom lectures, when I said it was okay with me if you looked at Wikipedia. Wikipedia, as some of you may know, also does not have the kind of gatekeeping that traditional encyclopedias still have. And once upon a time, before Wikipedia, all encyclopedias have. I've actually written articles for a couple of encyclopedias, and I'll tell you how that works, these traditional encyclopedias. They invite me to write an article. They tell me what they want the article to be about. Say there's an entry on Marshall McLuhan. I write the article. It's sent off to the publisher by me. And invariably, the publisher sends it out to some outside readers, as they're called, in addition to their own editors. And they read the article over very carefully, get back to me with a whole series of suggestions, some of which I have to make, some of which I don't have to make. And at that point, I can say, well, hey, you know what? I don't want to make these changes, in which case they'll hire somebody else to do the article. But usually I'll say, yes, I'll make those changes. And this can go back and forth for a while, and then eventually the article is published. That's gatekeeping in encyclopedias. On Wikipedia, as I'm sure you all know, anybody can write anything. Everyone is an editor and a writer on Wikipedia. And actually, Wikipedia goes back about as far as Amazon goes back. And Wikipedia was doing what it does even before Amazon put out its Kindle. And unsurprisingly, and we talked about this, in the academic world, a lot of people said about Amazon and Wikipedia the same thing. Hey, Wikipedia and Amazon, by not having gatekeepers, you're just going to open your books, in the case of Amazon, your online pages, in the case of Wikipedia, to nonsense and garbage. You're going to be worthless to the public. Well, in 2005, there's a magazine called Nature magazine. They're one of the world's leading scientific magazines. In fact, there are two big scientific magazines in the world. One of them is Science magazine, published out of Washington, D.C., here in the United States. The other is Nature magazine, published out of London in the United Kingdom. And Nature magazine did a little interesting survey experiment. they randomly looked at X number of pages in the Encyclopedia Britannica, which then, and still is to some extent, the world's leading encyclopedia. You know, for decades and decades, parents would buy their kids when they went to college or even when they went to high school, a set of Encyclopedia Britannica books. And this would be the great references that kids in high school would be able to use to look up material. You didn't have to run out to a library. So the Encyclopedia Britannica was the gold standard. Nature randomly looked at, say, 20 different randomly selected pages in the Encyclopedia Britannica. And they looked at it with an eye towards identifying errors. And what they wanted to find is, how many errors did they find on an average on a page in the Encyclopedia Britannica? And then these same researchers looked at Wikipedia, and they chose 10, or whatever the number was, randomly selected pages, and they looked to see the number of errors on those pages. And the results were astonishing and infuriating for the Encyclopedia Britannica, but the people at Wikipedia were jumping up and down and cheering, because these results showed that the average number of errors in the gold standard, the Encyclopedia Britannica, compared to the average number of errors in this upstart Wikipedia, which had no gatekeeping, anyone, anybody in the world, you didn't even have to have an account on Wikipedia. You could just be an anonymous person. You could write whatever you wanted in an article. These two encyclopedias, the Encyclopedia Britannica on the one hand, Wikipedia on the other hand, had the same average number of errors per page. So how could that be? Well, it's a fact. The experiment's been replicated many, many times. Actually, it's a sort of survey more than an experiment, but it manipulated variables. So that's why it's sometimes called an experiment. But the key to Wikipedia's success was, it turns out that Wikipedia also has an error correction system. Not a gatekeeper, though, who can prevent the article from being published in the first place if she or he finds an error. But the error identification and error correction people in Wikipedia, they're not editors who work for Wikipedia. They are the readers themselves. And this was an early example of crowdsourcing, which I know several of you are looking into also in your own research. What is crowdsourcing? You put something out there to the world, and you let the world do the work. You let the world do the editing. So if you're organizing a protest, you put word out on social media, and that can generate the crowd. Every article on Wikipedia, if you click on the history tab and you see the history, that history is a history of accounts, people who have edited the article. And in fact, there are a constant stream of errors on Wikipedia. The first time I looked at Wikipedia, there was an article on Pericles. You may recall I mentioned Pericles, and we talked about the rise of democracy in ancient Athens. And so I went to the Pericles page. This is true. The first time I looked at Wikipedia, and I saw that, okay, here was a whole article on Pericles, except in one place in the article, in the very first paragraph, some genius, probably some 10-year-old kid somewhere, changed the spelling of Pericles to Pickles, Pickles. So somebody making this joke. And I didn't even know how to use Wikipedia. Then I was just looking at it, as I said, for the first time. Before I left that Wikipedia session, that error had been corrected. Somebody read the same thing I did, went in there and just changed Pickles to Pericles in that paragraph. So it's not true that in a digital system, when you have no gatekeepers, there's no error correction. The error correction is there, it's just in a different place. It's in the public. It's in the world at large. And to sort of, conclude this and tie it into, again, one of the things we've been talking about, if you think about a protest movement such as Black Lives Matter, clearly the gatekeepers, we could call them that, the people who are in office, the politicians who we have elected to office, the police commissioners who are usually not elected but appointed by mayors. That old traditional process hasn't done the job. And although there's still a long way to go, the ground up, it's not coming from the top down, it's coming from the ground up, which is what all mass protest movements are. That may be beginning now, although there's still an enormous amount to be done, to be finally doing the job. So it's not surprising that what has enabled that, at least in part, some would say more than certainly a small part, a major part, is the digital revolution, the same revolution that led to Kindle changing the nature of publishing. The Kindle, which at first was just supposed to be something that made it easier for readers to get their books, right? You can get your book instantly when you're ordering it, if it's a Kindle, because it's just sent electronically. You don't have to wait for the postal service or any delivery service to get it to you. That was the reason that the Kindle was invented in the first place, but very quickly it revolutionized the process of being an author for authors. So it was not only a revolution for readers, it was a revolution for authors. And Wikipedia, again, just trying to get information out as quickly and efficiently as possible, does away with the traditional gatekeepers. And I wouldn't be surprised now if somebody did a survey and found that Wikipedia had even fewer errors than the Encyclopedia Britannica. But the point is, to say even that it has no greater number of errors than the Encyclopedia Britannica, that says an enormous amount as well. And finally, to move it into the social political context, you could say that Twitter and all of the social media, each in their own ways, unique ways, but also overlapping ways, to the extent that they have become this bubbling pot of possibilities of reform, even though the powers that be have resisted this for so long, that's yet another example of the digital revolution and how it's democratizing our society. Okay, so there you have an example of a positive impact of social media. And again, I know that many of you are looking at both the positive and the negative, but I think it's always important to look at the positive as well as the negative. There's a tendency in the scholarly world to think if you're not being critical of something, if you're not pointing out what's wrong with something, somehow you're not being a careful scholar. But it turns out that many times you can be a careful scholar, but what you're finding when you're carefully looking at something is not just negative results, but positive results as well. So the reason why I wanted to talk to you about this is I wanted to give you an example of, in many ways, a sterling and one of the most primary examples of how social media can have a positive effect. Let me also say that there are still people to this very day who think that gatekeeping is a better way of proceeding across all aspects of life, but certainly in the arts and in writing as well. And I don't know if those people will ever be convinced. I think it is undoubtedly true that the traditional gatekeeping did keep out a lot of unworthy material. But as I said, it also let a lot of great material languish in that churchyard that Thomas Gray was talking about all those years ago.